The gunshot echoed across the desolate plains of Montana Territory, 1878. As Beatrice Owens stumbled away from the wagon train, her heart pounding in her chest like a wild Mustang. Blood stained her once pristine blue traveling dress, but it wasn't hers. It belonged to the man who had promised to love and protect her. The man whose betrayal had brought her to this God-forsaken wilderness. The man whose body now lay cooling in the dirt behind her. "Thomas is dead," she whispered to the endless sky stretching above her. The weight of what she'd done crashed down upon her shoulders, though her hand had never touched the gun. The outlaw who'd shot him during the robbery was long gone, along with the other bandits who'd attacked their small wagon train. Thomas had stepped forward, trying to protect their meager possessions with nothing but false bravado and a small pocket knife. His foolishness had cost him his life. Beatrice fell to her knees in the tall prairie grass, her brown curls tumbling from their careful arrangement as she sobbed. The other travelers were busy tending to the wounded, gathering what possessions remained, and preparing to move on toward Fort Benton. No one had time for a new widow whose husband had gotten himself killed through his own arrogance. She didn't know how long she knelt there, but eventually, her tears dried in salty tracks down her dirt-smudged cheeks. The wagon master, a gruff man named Harold, approached her with heavy footsteps. "Mrs. Peterson, we need to move on before nightfall. I'm sorry about your husband, but we can't risk another attack." Beatrice nodded numbly. "I understand. Do you have family in Fort Benton? Someone expecting you?" She shook her head. "No, Thomas said there would be opportunities there." "That's all I know." Harold's weathered face creased with concern. "A woman alone, it won't be easy." "I'm not going to Fort Benton," she said suddenly, the decision crystallizing in her mind. "Thomas dragged me out here on promises and lies. I won't follow his ghost to another dead end." "There's a settlement about 5 miles east of here, Whispering Pines. It's small but growing. Might be a place for you to catch your breath, figure things out." Beatrice stood, brushing the dirt from her skirts with trembling hands. "I'll go there." Harold hesitated. "Are you sure?" "You'd be safer with us." "Safer?" A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "I've never been safe a day in my life with Thomas. At least on my own, I'll only have myself to blame for my misfortunes." The wagon master sighed and gestured to one of the men. "Jasper will take you in his wagon. We can spare some supplies, not much, but enough to get you started." An hour later, Beatrice found herself sitting beside a thin, nervous man named Jasper, bouncing along a rutted trail toward Whispering Pines. Her few possessions were packed in a single trunk, and a small bundle of supplies sat at her feet. "Terrible business, just terrible," Jasper muttered, more to himself than to her. "Bandits getting bolder every year. My sister lost her husband to Blackfoot raiders back in '74. Beatrice said nothing, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She'd spent 5 years married to Thomas Peterson, watching him gamble away what little they had, following him from one failed venture to another. When he'd announced they were heading west to seek their fortune, she'd had no choice but to pack up and follow. Thomas had been a poor husband, sometimes cruel, often neglectful, but she'd never wished him dead. As the wagon crested a small rise, Whispering Pines came into view. It wasn't much a single dusty street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple rising at one end, corrals and stables at the other. Smoke curled from chimneys, and horses were hitched outside what appeared to be a saloon. "Here we are, Mrs. Peterson," Jasper said, pulling the wagon to a halt near the general store. "Such as it is." "Owens," Beatrice said firmly. "My name is Beatrice Owens now." Jasper gave her a puzzled look but didn't question her. "Well, Miss Owens, I wish you the best of luck." The owner of the general store, a plump woman named Mrs. Gardner, took pity on Beatrice after hearing her story or the version of it she chose to tell, omitting Thomas's failures and focusing on the bandit attack. "You poor dear," Mrs. Gardner clucked. "There's a room above the store you can use for a few days until you find your feet. My husband won't mind." Beatrice accepted the offer gratefully, though the thought of finding her feet seemed impossible. She had less than $20 to her name, no marketable skills except basic housekeeping, and no connections in this rough frontier town. That night, she lay on a narrow cot in the small room, listening to the sounds of the settlement. Raucous laughter spilled from the saloon down the street. A dog barked incessantly. Someone shouted, and then there was silence. Beatrice stared at the ceiling, wondering how she had arrived at this point in her life. She was 23 years old, widowed, alone, with nothing but uncertainty ahead of her. In the darkness, she allowed herself to weep one last time for the dreams that had died long before Thomas did. Morning brought with it a renewed determination. Beatrice washed her face in the basin provided, pinned her hair into a practical knot, and put on her second-best dress, a faded green cotton that had seen better days. She couldn't afford to wallow in grief or self-pity. Mrs. Gardner was sweeping the front porch when Beatrice came downstairs. "I need work," Beatrice said without preamble. "Any kind of respectable work. I can cook, clean, sew a bit. I learn quickly." Mrs. Gardner leaned on her broom. "Not much call for that sort of thing here, I'm afraid. Most men take care of themselves or have wives. There must be something." The older woman chewed her lip thoughtfully. "Well, the saloon's always looking for girls, but I wouldn't recommend that for a lady such as yourself." Beatrice stiffened. "No, not that. Doc Miller might need help. His wife passed last winter, and he's been struggling to keep up with his patients and his housekeeping. You could inquire there." With directions to the doctor's house at the edge of town, Beatrice set off with purpose in her stride. The morning sun was already hot on her back as she walked down the dusty main street. Men paused in their activities to watch her pass, and she kept her eyes straight ahead, ignoring their stares. Dr. Miller's house was a modest two-story structure with a sign out front announcing his practice. Beatrice knocked on the door and waited, smoothing her skirts nervously. The man who answered was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with circles under his eyes and a harried expression that softened into surprise when he saw her. "Can I help you, madam?" "I hope I might help you, actually," Beatrice said. "I'm told you may need household assistance. I'm looking for work." The doctor ran a hand through his disheveled brown hair. "Who sent you?" "Mrs. Gardner. That woman is determined to organize my life. She mentioned you might need help, yes." He sighed and stepped back, gesturing for her to enter. "Come in, Miss Owens, Beatrice Owens." The interior of the house was a testament to a man living alone without time for housekeeping. Books and papers were scattered everywhere, dishes piled in the kitchen sink, and a fine layer of dust covered most surfaces. "As you can see," Dr. Miller said with a rueful smile, "Mrs. Gardner wasn't wrong. I've been rather overwhelmed since Elizabeth died." "I'm sorry for your loss," Beatrice said quietly. "Thank you, it's been difficult." He cleared his throat. "You're new to Whispering Pines?" "Yes, I arrived yesterday. My husband was killed in a bandit attack on our wagon train." The doctor's expression softened with sympathy. "I'm terribly sorry, Mrs. Owens." "It's Miss Owens now," she corrected him firmly, "and what I need is work, not sympathy." Something in her tone made him look at her more closely. "Of course. I can offer room and board, plus $2 a week for cooking, cleaning, and helping with patients when needed. Nothing improper," he added quickly. "Changing bandages, preparing medicines, that sort of thing. It wasn't much, but it was a start. When would you like me to begin?" "Immediately, if possible. I have patients to see this afternoon." And so Beatrice found herself with a new position, a small room at the back of Dr. Miller's house, and a purpose to fill her days. The work was harder than she'd anticipated. The doctor saw patients at all hours, which meant meals at irregular times and laundry perpetually stained with blood, and other substances she preferred not to identify. But Dr. Miller James, as he asked her to call him after the first week, was a kind employer. He was patient when she made mistakes, grateful for her efforts, and respectful of her privacy. For the first time in years, Beatrice felt a measure of peace. As summer turned to fall, Beatrice settled into life in Whispering Pines. She became known as Doc Miller's housekeeper, a position that afforded her a degree of respectability in the small community. She attended church on Sundays, made acquaintances with other women in town, and slowly began to build a life for herself. But not everyone in Whispering Pines welcomed her presence. Elijah Thornton owned the largest ranch in the area and considered himself something of a local power. His wife had died years earlier, leaving him with a grown son who was even more unpleasant than his father. Both men had taken an unwelcome interest in Beatrice. "A woman like you shouldn't be wasting her time playing nurse," Thornton said one day when he encountered her at the general store. "A proper husband is what you need." Beatrice kept her expression neutral. "I'm content with my current situation, Mr. Thornton." "Content?" he laughed. "A young widow like yourself, living under the same roof as the doctor. People talk, you know." "Let them talk," she replied coldly. "Doctor Miller is a perfect gentleman, and I am his employee. Nothing more." Thornton leaned closer, his breath hot against her cheek. "I could offer you a much more comfortable position, Mrs. Owens." "Miss Owens," she corrected, stepping away from him. "And I'm not interested in any position you might offer." His face hardened. "You might want to reconsider that. I'm an influential man in these parts." Beatrice gathered her purchases and met his gaze steadily. "Good day, Mr. Thornton." She didn't tell James about the encounter, not wanting to worry him. But over the following weeks, she noticed Thornton watching her whenever she ventured into town. His son, Cyrus, was even more blatant, making crude remarks loud enough for her to hear when she passed. Winter arrived with bitter cold and howling winds that rattled the windows of the doctor's house. Beatrice found herself spending more time indoors, assisting James with his patients, many of whom suffered from frostbite, pneumonia, and other winter ailments. Working so closely with him, she couldn't help but notice how his hands, though strong, were gentle when tending to the sick. How his voice remained calm even in the most dire situations. How his eyes, a deep brown that reminded her of rich coffee, crinkled at the corners when he smiled, which was more often now than when she'd first arrived. "You've transformed this house," James said one evening as they sat by the fire after a long day. "And my practice. I don't know how I managed before you came." Beatrice looked up from her mending, surprised by the warmth in his voice. "You managed, just not very well." He laughed, the sound making something flutter in her chest. "True enough. But it's more than the cleaning and cooking. It's having someone to talk to, someone who understands." She understood all too well. The loneliness of the past months had been eased by his companionship, by their conversations over meals, by the quiet evenings like this one. "I feel the same," she admitted softly. James opened his mouth to say something more, but a pounding at the door interrupted him. A moment later, they were rushing to help a miner who'd crushed his leg in an accident at one of the nearby claims. Days passed in a blur of work and winter weather. Christmas approached, bringing with it a festive spirit despite the harsh conditions. Beatrice decorated the house with pine boughs and candles, baked special treats when supplies allowed, and even helped James prepare small gifts for his youngest patients. On Christmas Eve, they returned from the church service to find a package on the doorstep. Inside was a beautiful wool shawl in deep blue, with a card that simply read, "For Miss Owens with appreciation." "J.M. James," she breathed, running her fingers over the soft fabric. "It's lovely, but you shouldn't have. I wanted to," he interrupted. "You deserve something beautiful." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Beatrice felt her cheeks flush, and not from the cold. "I have something for you as well," she said, retrieving a small package from her room. "It's not much." James unwrapped the hand-knitted scarf she'd been working on in secret for weeks. "It's perfect," he said, immediately winding it around his neck. "How does it look?" "Very distinguished," she replied with a smile. He stepped closer, his expression serious now. Beatrice, again, they were interrupted, this time by the arrival of the sheriff with an emergency. A bar fight had turned deadly, and James was needed urgently. Winter slowly gave way to spring, and with the thaw came new challenges. A fever swept through town, keeping James and Beatrice busy day and night. They worked side by side, their partnership strengthened by the crisis. When the worst had passed, leaving 6 graves in the small cemetery, they were both exhausted but somehow closer than before. "You could have left," James said one evening as they sat on the front porch, watching the sunset. "When the fever was at its worst. Many did." Beatrice shook her head. "And go where? Besides, you needed me." "I still do," he said quietly. "Not just as my assistant or housekeeper." Her heart quickened, but before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Elijah Thornton and his son rode up to the house, their expressions grim. "Doctor," Thornton called, dismounting. "One of my ranch hands took a bad fall. Broke his arm, maybe worse. Need you to come out to the ranch." James stood. "Of course, I'll get my bag." "The woman can come too," Thornton said, his eyes settling on Beatrice with an unpleasant gleam. "Might need help with the tending." "I don't think that's necessary," James began, but Beatrice interrupted. "I'll come. 2 pairs of hands are better than 1 if the injury is serious." James gave her a concerned look but nodded. "I'll saddle the horses." The ride to the Thornton ranch took over an hour, with the sun setting behind the mountains as they arrived. Beatrice had never visited the property before and was surprised by its size and obvious prosperity. The main house was the largest she'd seen since leaving the East, with a wide veranda and glass windows that glowed with lamplight. "Cyrus will show you to the bunkhouse where Jenkins is laid up," Thornton told James. "Miss Owens can wait in the house." "I came to assist, Doctor." "Miller," Beatrice said firmly. Thornton's mouth tightened, but he nodded to his son. "Take them both, then." The injured man's break was indeed serious, requiring James to set the bone while Beatrice assisted. By the time they finished, it was fully dark outside. "Too late for you to be riding back tonight," Thornton announced when they returned to the main house. "You'll stay here, we have plenty of room," James frowned. "That's not necessary, we can make it back to town." "Nonsense, it's a moonless night and the trail can be treacherous, I insist." Beatrice didn't like the idea of staying under Thornton's roof, but the older man was right about the dangers of the trail at night. Reluctantly, she and James accepted the offer of hospitality. Dinner was an uncomfortable affair, with Cyrus making thinly veiled suggestive comments that his father did little to discourage. James grew increasingly tense, his knuckles white around his fork. "Miss Owens has been a tremendous help to my practice," he said after one particularly inappropriate remark. "The entire town values her contributions." "I'm sure they do," Cyrus smirked. "A woman with her assets is always valuable." "That's enough," James snapped, his patience clearly at an end. Thornton raised a hand. "My son means no disrespect, Doctor. We simply find it unusual for a young, unmarried woman to live under the same roof as a bachelor, even if he is the town physician." "My living arrangements are my own concern," Beatrice said coldly. "Of course they are," Thornton agreed with false sincerity. "But reputations are fragile things, especially for women in your situation." After dinner, Beatrice was shown to a guest room on the 2nd floor. The room was luxurious compared to her simple quarters at James's house, but she felt uneasy. She barricaded the door with a chair before changing into the nightgown provided and lying down on the bed, fully intending to stay awake until morning. Despite her resolve, she must have dozed off because she awoke with a start to the sound of her door handle turning. The chair held, and whoever was on the other side cursed softly. "Who's there?" she called, her heart pounding. "Just checking to make sure you're comfortable, Miss Owens," came Cyrus Thornton's voice, slurred with drink. "Perhaps you'd like some company." "Go away," she said firmly, "or I'll call for Dr. Miller." A low chuckle. "The good doctor's room is on the other side of the house. He won't hear you." The door handle rattled again, more forcefully this time. Beatrice looked around frantically for a weapon and grabbed the heavy ceramic water pitcher from the washstand. "I'm warning you, Mr. Thornton. Leave now." The pressure on the door increased, and the chair began to scrape across the floor. Beatrice raised the pitcher, prepared to defend herself, when suddenly there was a commotion in the hallway. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" James's voice, tight with fury. "Mind your own business, Doctor," Cyrus slurred. There was a thud, followed by a grunt of pain. The pressure on Beatrice's door ceased. "Beatrice, are you all right?" James called. She rushed to remove the chair and opened the door to find James standing over Cyrus, who was sprawled on the floor, blood trickling from his nose. "I'm fine," she assured him, clutching her wrapper around herself. He didn't get in. James's face was a mask of cold anger as he looked down at the younger Thornton. "Get up," he ordered. "And if you ever come near Miss Owens again, a bloody nose will be the least of your concerns." Cyrus staggered to his feet, glaring at them both. "You'll regret this," he muttered before stumbling away down the hall. "Pack your things," James told Beatrice. "We're leaving, but it's the middle of the night. I don't care. I'm not leaving you in this house another minute." 10 minutes later, they were riding away from the Thornton ranch, guided by a lantern James had insisted on borrowing. The night was indeed dark, but the trail was wide enough that they made steady progress. "How did you know?" Beatrice asked after they'd put some distance between themselves and the ranch. "I didn't trust them," James replied grimly. "I was already on my way to check on you when I heard Cyrus at your door." They rode in silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of hooves on dirt oddly comforting in the darkness. "Thank you," Beatrice said finally, "for coming to my aid." James reined his horse closer to hers. "I would never let anyone harm you, Beatrice." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten with emotion. For so long, she'd been alone, fighting her own battles. Having someone stand beside her, someone who genuinely cared for her welfare, was both foreign and desperately welcome. The incident at the Thornton ranch marked a turning point. Back in town, rumors began to circulate twisted versions of events that cast Beatrice in an unflattering light. Some whispered that she had enticed young Thornton, then cried foul when discovered. Others suggested that she had designs on the doctor's modest fortune. Beatrice held her head high, ignoring the sidelong glances and hushed conversations that stopped when she entered the general store or the church. But the gossip took its toll. "Perhaps I should find employment elsewhere," she suggested to James one evening. "My presence is causing difficulties for your practice." "Absolutely not," he said firmly. "The people who matter know the truth. The rest can go to hell." She'd never heard him speak so forcefully, and it warmed her to know he was so determined to defend her. Spring bloomed fully, bringing with it new life and renewed energy to Whispering Pines. The town was growing, with new buildings under construction and more settlers arriving each month. Among them was a young lawyer named Samuel Wells, who opened an office next to the general store and quickly became a popular figure in the community. Unlike many of the local men, Wells was educated, well-spoken, and impeccably dressed. He attended church regularly, volunteered for community projects, and was universally praised for his integrity and charm. He also showed a marked interest in Beatrice. "Miss Owens," he greeted her one Sunday after church. "I wonder if you might permit me to call on you sometime this week. I find myself in need of female perspective on the decoration of my new home." Beatrice was surprised by the request. Since the Thornton incident, few men in town had spoken to her directly, let alone sought her company. "That's very kind, Mr. Wells, but I'm quite busy with my duties at Dr. Miller's practice." "Surely the good doctor can spare you for an hour or two," Wells persisted with a charming smile. "I've heard you have excellent taste, and I'm completely at a loss when it comes to creating a proper home." Before Beatrice could respond, James appeared at her side. "Ready to go, Beatrice? I need to check on Mrs. Peterson's new baby this afternoon." Wells tipped his hat to the doctor. "Miller, I was just asking Miss Owens if she might advise me on some domestic matters. You wouldn't object to lending her services for an afternoon, would you?" Something flickered in James's eyes, annoyance. Concern? That would be up to Miss Owens, of course. Beatrice felt caught between them. Wells was being perfectly polite, and there was nothing improper about his request. Yet something in James's demeanor made her hesitate. "Perhaps next Sunday after church," she offered as a compromise. "If you're still in need of advice then." Wells beamed. "Excellent, I look forward to it." As they walked home, James was unusually quiet. "Is something troubling you?" Beatrice asked finally. He shook his head. "Nothing important." "You don't approve of Mr. Wells," James sighed. "I have no reason not to approve of him. He seems perfectly respectable. But nothing. If you wish to spend time with him, that's your choice. You're not obligated to me beyond our professional arrangement." His tone was so formal, so distant, that Beatrice felt a chill despite the warm spring day. "James, we should hurry," he interrupted. "Mrs. Peterson will be expecting us." The next week passed in a strange tension. James was unfailingly polite but withdrawn, spending more time than usual with his patients and less in conversation with Beatrice. She found herself missing their easy companionship, the quiet evenings by the fire, the shared jokes over breakfast. Sunday arrived, and after church, Beatrice kept her promise to visit Samuel Wells's new home. The small house was indeed in need of a woman's touch, with bare windows, mismatched furniture, and a general air of bachelor disarray. "As you can see, I'm completely hopeless," Wells admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "My mother would be appalled." Beatrice spent an hour offering suggestions about curtains, rugs, and the arrangement of furniture. Wells was attentive, writing down her ideas and asking thoughtful questions. When she mentioned that she should be getting back, he insisted on walking her home. "I've enjoyed your company tremendously, Miss Owens," he said as they approached the doctor's house. "Perhaps you would do me the honor of joining me for dinner next week. The hotel dining room is quite respectable." Beatrice hesitated. Wells was handsome, educated, and clearly interested in her. Under different circumstances, she might have been flattered by his attention, but something held her back. "That's very kind, Mr. Wells, but I don't think it would be appropriate." He looked surprised. "Because of your position with Dr. Miller, I assure you, no one would think it improper for us to dine together in a public establishment. It's not that. I'm not interested in pursuing any romantic attachments at present." Wells studied her face. "I see. Is there someone else?" The question caught her off guard. Was there someone else? The image of James came unbidden to her mind, his kind eyes, his gentle hands, the way he'd defended her against the Thorntons. "My situation is complicated," she said finally. Wells nodded slowly. "I understand. But should your situation change, my invitation remains open." When Beatrice entered the house, she found James in his study, reading a medical journal. He looked up briefly. "How was your visit with Wells?" "Fine. His house needs work, but it has potential." "I'm sure he was grateful for your advice." She could sense his distraction, his deliberate distance. "He asked me to dine with him next week." The journal closed with a snap. "I see, and will you?" I declined. James finally met her gaze, surprise evident in his expression. "May I ask why?" Beatrice took a deep breath. "Because my heart is already engaged elsewhere." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. James set aside his journal and stood, crossing the room to stand before her. "Beatrice," he said softly, "what are you saying?" "I think you know." His hand, so steady when tending to patients, trembled slightly as he reached up to touch her cheek. "I have no right to ask anything of you. You came here seeking independence, a fresh start." "And I found something I wasn't looking for," she whispered. The kiss, when it came, was gentle at first, a question, an offering. Beatrice responded with all the longing she'd kept buried for months, her hands sliding up to his shoulders, drawing him closer. When they finally parted, James rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since Christmas," he admitted. Beatrice smiled. What took you so long, doctor? Fear, doubt, the worry that I was taking advantage of your position. I've never felt taken advantage of, not by you. They might have stayed there, lost in each other, if not for the urgent knocking at the front door. With a rueful smile, James stepped back. A doctor's work is never done, he sighed. We'll continue this conversation later, but later proved elusive. A mining accident brought multiple injured men to town, requiring James's attention for days. By the time things calmed down, word had spread throughout Whispering Pines that Elijah Thornton was organizing a town meeting to discuss concerns about moral standards in our growing community. He means us, Beatrice said when James showed her the notice. This is his revenge for what happened at the ranch. James's jaw tightened. Let him try, we've done nothing wrong. That doesn't matter, you know how people talk. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday evening in the church. Despite James's objections, Beatrice insisted on attending. I won't hide away as if I'm ashamed, she declared. The church was packed when they arrived, with nearly every resident of Whispering Pines in attendance. Thornton stood at the front, his son beside him, both wearing expressions of righteous concern. Friends and neighbors, Thornton began once everyone was seated. I've called this meeting because I believe our community is at a crossroads. As we grow, we must ensure that we maintain the moral standards that make a town worth living in. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Recent events have brought to light certain arrangements that may not reflect the values we wish to uphold. His gaze settled on Beatrice and James, sitting side by side in the back row. I refer specifically to unmarried men and women living under the same roof, regardless of the professional pretext. The murmurs grew louder. James started to rise, but Beatrice placed a restraining hand on his arm. Moreover, Thornton continued, when attempts are made to counsel those involved, they respond with violence and defiance. That's a lie, James called out, unable to contain himself any longer. Your son attempted to force his way into Miss Owens's room in the middle of the night. Any man would have defended her honor. Gasps and whispers filled the church, Cyrus Thornton's face flushed with anger. Slander, the elder Thornton shouted. My son was merely checking on the welfare of our guest when your jealousy overcame your reason, doctor. Before James could respond, another voice cut through the chaos. If I may speak. All heads turned to see Samuel Wells standing, his expression grave. As the newest member of this community, perhaps I can offer an outside perspective. Thornton frowned but nodded. Go ahead, counselor. Wells moved to the front of the church, his manner calm and authoritative. I've practiced law in several frontier towns, and I've observed that the most successful communities are those that focus on building each other up rather than tearing each other down. He paused, looking around the room. Dr. Miller has saved countless lives in this town. Miss Owens assists him in that vital work. Their living arrangement is a practical solution to the demands of medical practice, where emergencies occur at all hours. Several people nodded, including Mrs. Gardner from the general store. As for Mr. Thornton's allegations, Wells continued, I find it interesting that he waits until now, after a business disagreement with the doctor, to raise these concerns. What disagreement? Someone called out. Wells turned to Thornton with raised eyebrows. Shall I tell them or will you? Thornton's face darkened. This is irrelevant. I don't think so, Wells insisted. Last month, Dr. Miller refused to falsify a medical report that would have allowed Mr. Thornton to collect insurance on a disabled ranch hand who is, in fact, perfectly healthy. Shocked exclamations filled the church. Thornton sputtered. That's an outrageous accusation. Is it? Wells asked calmly. I have the documentation in my office, including a sworn statement from the ranch hand in question, who has since left your employ. The mood in the room shifted perceptibly. People who had been looking at Beatrice and James with suspicion now turned their disapproving gazes on Thornton. This meeting is about moral standards, Thornton insisted, his voice rising. About a woman of questionable virtue living with an unmarried man. An older woman in the front row stood up. "I've known James Miller since he was a boy," she said firmly. "His father was my husband's best friend. There isn't a more honorable man in this territory." Another voice joined in. "Doctor, Miller saved my son's life last winter. I don't care if he lives with 10 women as long as he's here when we need him." More voices rose in support, and Thornton's face grew redder with each one. Finally, the minister stepped forward. "I believe we've heard enough," he said, placing a calming hand on Thornton's arm. "This community appreciates your concern, Mr. Thornton, but it seems the matter is settled." As the meeting broke up, people approached James and Beatrice, offering words of support and apologies for having doubted them. Thornton and his son stalked out without speaking to anyone. Wells made his way through the crowd to where Beatrice and James stood. "I hope you don't mind my intervention," he said. "I've been investigating Thornton for several weeks on behalf of the insurance company. Your situation provided the perfect opportunity to bring it to light." "Thank you," James said, extending his hand. "I misjudged you, counselor." Wells shook the offered hand with a smile. "No harm done. Though I admit, my interest in Miss Owens wasn't entirely professional. She's a remarkable woman." "On that we agree completely," James replied, his gaze softening as he looked at Beatrice. Walking home after the meeting, Beatrice felt as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The stars seemed brighter, the spring air sweeter. "What happens now?" she asked James as they reached the house. He took her hands in his. "Now I finish what I started to say before we were interrupted. Beatrice Owens, I love you. I have loved you since you stormed into my messy house and started ordering me about." She laughed, tears of joy pricking at her eyes. "Is that so?" "It is. And if you'll have me, I would very much like to make our arrangement permanent, not as employer and housekeeper, but as husband and wife." Beatrice's heart swelled with emotion. After all the pain, all the struggle, to find this kind of love seemed almost miraculous. "I love you too," she whispered, "but there's something you should know about my past before you propose." James shook his head. "Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. I know who you are now, and that's all I care about." "Please," she insisted, "I need to tell you." Inside, seated before the fire, Beatrice told him everything about Thomas's gambling, his cruelty, how she had stopped loving him long before his death. How she had felt relief, not grief, when he was killed. "The day the wagon train was attacked, when I saw him fall, my first thought was I'm free. What kind of woman thinks that about her dying husband?" James listened without interruption, his expression compassionate. When she finished, he took her hands in his. "A woman who endured far more than she should have," he said gently. "Beatrice, we can't choose our feelings, only our actions. You stayed with him, did your duty as his wife. That speaks to your character far more than your private thoughts at his death." "After he died, I overheard some of the other women talking. One said, 'No man will have her now,' as if being Thomas's widow had somehow marked me, made me undesirable." James's eyes darkened with emotion. "They were wrong," he said firmly, drawing her into his arms. He kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and passion, before whispering against her lips, "No man will have you now because you're mine. My love, my partner, my forever." Beatrice melted into his embrace, finally home after a journey longer and harder than any wagon trail west. They were married 2 weeks later in the same church where Thornton had tried to disgrace them. The whole town turned out for the ceremony, eager to show their support for the doctor and his bride. Even Samuel Wells attended, gallantly kissing Beatrice's cheek and shaking James's hand, before departing for his next assignment in Helena. The Thorntons were conspicuously absent, having left town under a cloud of scandal following Wells's revelations. Rumor had it they'd relocated to Wyoming Territory, where Elijah hoped to rebuild his reputation and fortune. Summer passed in a golden haze of happiness for the newlyweds. Beatrice continued to assist James in his practice, now with the added joy of sharing his name and his bed. Their home, once merely a place of work for her, became truly theirs as they made small improvements to gather curtains sewn by Beatrice's hand. A new bookshelf built by James over the course of several evenings. In August, a letter arrived from Mrs. Gardner's cousin in San Francisco, offering James a position at a new hospital being built there. The salary was substantial, the opportunity prestigious. "What do you think?" James asked Beatrice as they discussed the offer over dinner. It would mean leaving Whispering Pines, starting fresh in a big city. Beatrice considered the question carefully. A year ago, she would have jumped at the chance to leave the small town and its memories behind, but now, "This is our home," she said simply. "These are our people. They stood by us when it mattered. I don't want to leave." James smiled, relief evident in his expression. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've been thinking. The town is growing. We could expand the practice, perhaps build a proper clinic. With a larger facility, we could help more people." "That sounds perfect," Beatrice agreed, "though we might need to consider a larger house as well." James looked up from his plate, a question in his eyes. Beatrice placed a hand over her still flat stomach. "For the new addition we're expecting in spring." The joy that spread across James's face was everything she'd hoped for. He was out of his chair in an instant, kneeling beside her, his hands covering hers. "Are you certain?" She nodded, her own happiness bubbling up in laughter. "As certain as a doctor's wife with medical training can be." He gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." "The first of many, I hope," Beatrice said, leaning back to see his face. "I always wanted a large family." "Then a large family you shall have, Mrs. Miller," James promised, sealing the vow with a kiss. The news of Beatrice's pregnancy spread quickly through town, bringing a stream of well-wishers and gifts. The women who had once whispered behind her back now sought her advice on medical matters, respecting her knowledge as the doctor's wife and assistant. As her belly grew, so did plans for the new clinic. James purchased land at the edge of town and hired builders to construct a 2-story building medical facilities on the ground floor, living quarters above. Beatrice's input was sought on every aspect of the design, from the layout of the examination rooms to the placement of windows for optimal light. "It will be the finest medical facility between Helena and Bozeman," James declared proudly as they surveyed the progress one crisp autumn day. Beatrice leaned against him, his arm warm around her shoulders. "And our children will grow up here, learning to help others as you do." "As we do," he corrected gently. "You're as much a healer as I am now." The baby arrived on a stormy April night in 1879, a robust girl with her father's dark eyes and her mother's determined spirit. They named her Elizabeth, after James's first wife, a gesture that brought tears to the eyes of the older residents who had known her. "She would be pleased," Mrs. Gardner said when she came to visit the new mother and child. She always worried about James being alone after she was gone. Beatrice, cradling her daughter, smiled at the thought. "Then I hope she knows he'll never be alone again." The years that followed brought more children, twin boys, Joseph and Jonathan, born in 1881, and another daughter, Mary, in 1884. The Miller Clinic became known throughout the territory for its excellent care, drawing patients from neighboring settlements and passing wagon trains. Whispering Pines grew into a proper town, with a school, a bank, and even a small theater. Beatrice, between raising her children and assisting at the clinic, found time to help establish a women's aid society that provided support to new settlers and widows. On their 10th anniversary, James surprised Beatrice with a trip to San Francisco, their first real vacation since their marriage. They left the children in the capable care of Mrs. Gardner and her daughter, who now helped run the clinic, and boarded the train west. San Francisco was everything Beatrice had imagined and more bustling, cosmopolitan, filled with wonders she'd only read about. They visited the grand hotels, dined in fine restaurants, and walked arm in arm along the waterfront, watching ships come and go from distant ports. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked as they stood looking out at the Pacific Ocean, the setting sun painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. "Not coming here when we had the chance? You could have had all this." Beatrice turned to him, the man who had saved her in more ways than one, whose love had given her a home, a family, a purpose. "Not for a single moment," she said with absolute certainty. "Everything I want, everything I need is in Whispering Pines." James drew her into his arms, his kiss as tender and passionate as the first they'd shared a decade earlier. "I fall in love with you more each day, Beatrice Miller." "As I do with you," she whispered against his lips. "My love, my partner, my forever." 10 days later, they returned home to the joyful chaos of their children, the familiar routine of the clinic, the community that had embraced them through good times and bad. As the carriage brought them up the main street, now lined with proper buildings and boardwalks, Beatrice reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had arrived in Whispering Pines a broken woman, carrying the weight of a failed marriage and an uncertain future. She had believed, truly believed, that no man would want her damaged goods, a widow with nothing to offer but her labor. How wrong she had been. In this small frontier town, she had found not just a husband but a partner, not just a home but a community, not just a job but a calling. As the carriage stopped before their house, their children spilled out the door, faces alight with excitement. James helped her down, his hand warm and steady as it had been from the beginning. "Welcome home, my love," he said softly. Beatrice looked at her family, the tall, kind man who had healed her heart, the beautiful children they had created together, the home they had built with love and dedication, and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. "It's good to be home," she replied, stepping forward into the arms of her forever.